Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Region 11's monthly webinar series. My name is Erica Ricario-Thorpe, and I am part of the Chapter Relations team at HFMA. To kick off the webinar, we would like to thank our sponsors, AmPlus, Commerce Healthcare, Progressive Management Systems, Parallel, Firm, TCF Capital Solutions, Harris & Harris, Extend Healthcare, Access One, HRG, AccuReg, Novus, Mail My Statements, Verloft, Premier, Centauri, TrueBridge, Avidyne Health, Patient Matters, Argos Health, RMC, Enable Comp, State, Sherlock, Aid Bailey, Softtech, OVAG International, and Vitalware. Your participation is requested. There will be a live Q&A during the webinar, so put your questions in the Q&A pod. We'll also be utilizing the chat pod to share information and tips during the session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ramona Hernandez, RE2 for Region 11.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Rupesh Hazar. Mr. Rupesh is a senior manager at Deloitte with over 12 years of engagement experience leading assessments and large-scale transformation projects involving revenue cycle, shared services, migration, outsourcing, advisory services, M&A integration, and performance improvements. Mr. Rupesh has extensive experience consulting healthcare systems, non-for-profit, faith-based, academic, and for-profit across all settings of healthcare. And he has also co-authored the Deloitte's positioning on the future of revenue cycle. Next, we have Curtis Miller. Curtis Miller is a manager at Deloitte, specializing in solving complex financial problems faced by healthcare providers through advanced analytics, data visualization solutions. He leads the provider practice effort to institute process mining and cutting-edge approach to identifying I can't even say that word, but inefficiency processes. Beyond processes mining, he leads the teams and data scientists, computer programmers, and subject matter experts to deliver the machine learning solutions at scale to all providers. Mike Ross is our next speaker. He's also a manager at Deloitte, specializing in bringing intelligent automation solutions to the healthcare provider clients with Deloitte. Over the course of his 7 years with Deloitte, he has helped implement 20 plus automations, both onshore and offshore. He's also planned on and stood up digital transformations office. He's planned for and stood up digital transformation offices and managed the productization of machine learning capabilities focused on improving the financial health of provider organizations. Sorry, I got tongue-tied. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers of Deloitte. Thanks, guys. Rupesh?
Thanks so much, Ramona. Apologies, I was fumbling for the mute button, part of the challenges of Zoom.
Yes.
Thank you for that introduction, though. Deloitte leadership, healthcare leadership, about 18 months ago, took on a very ambitious initiative based off of all of the current trends. And if you think about what has happened in healthcare over the last 10 years, all of the explosion in terms of investment in EMR, Affordable Care Act, all of those different things, Deloitte healthcare leadership really wanted to focus on what was coming next, what was coming not just in the next 18 months, but they really wanted to think about where do we think healthcare will go in the next 20 years. And so we want to talk a little bit today about Deloitte's point of view around the future of health. Then we want to sit down and talk to you a little bit about where we think the future of revenue cycle will go along with that. And then we want to give you some tangible examples of what we think will happen in the next 5 years specific to revenue cycle and some of the things that are going on right now. the slide is turning really slowly, so apologies. In terms of where we think the future of health will go in 2040, we think the biggest driver of change in healthcare is going to be affordable health for all. And you can see this already today with the rising costs of healthcare, how healthcare is increasing as a percent of GDP spend. We're seeing this especially in the pandemic with the breakout of virtual care. But also, in the last couple of years, we started to see more growth in terms of health hubs in communities. We've been seeing over the last 5 years the shift from fee-for-service and the break-fix model of healthcare towards more of a well-being model that's focused more on outcomes. And we really think all of these will help drive the change in the way healthcare is delivered. As we move towards personalized health, and we're going to have to overcome a couple of major barriers. And so I'm going to walk you through some of these barriers, and then I'm going to walk you through in the subsequent slides some of the assumptions you have to make in order to understand our point of view as it relates to the future of health. But some of the barriers I want to talk about is the availability and accessibility of healthcare. The ability to understand your own personal health information. That's going to be one of the big barriers. Getting answers in close to real time, and not having to wait, getting more proactive care rather than reactive care. And one of the other big ones is interoperability. We're going to need physicians to be able to look prospectively at clinical data and real-time information instead of focusing on the retrospective review that I just referenced. And I'm going to say all of this with a bit of a grain of salt. We can't obviously predict the future. And the future of health, our point of view, is very directional. But what we're really trying to do is paint a picture of the potential and likely future so that we can logically play out these macro trends and implications, and then understand what the influences are specifically to revenue cycle, and think through for ourselves as well as the folks on the call today, where are the investments that need to be made? What are the strategic decisions and the strategic visions for these healthcare ecosystems that need to be made that will dictate those investments and those strategic decisions? And before we transition, the one point I want to think about here is, if you think back, for those of you old enough, and I do put myself in that category, but if you think back to the 80s, where Kodak was sitting there, and they were a market leader, and they were in an extremely lucrative market, and they didn't want to disrupt themselves, and I don't think they foresaw the disruption that was coming. But had they anticipated what was coming, specifically digital cameras, their ability to react would have been much different. And now, you think about Kodak and film as more of a novelty or something on the fringes. But if you think back to the 80s, nobody could have thought about the type of change and disruption that was going to come. And that's the same type of lens we want to bring to the future of health. So before we start, and I'll go into some of our assumptions on the next slide. But before we start, what I want to iterate one point. The way we're defining health is defined holistically as an overall state of well-being, encompassing physical, mental, social, emotional, spiritual, and financial health. And what this means is healthcare will be delivered in completely different settings of care, which can be provided at any time and accessed at any time through a variety of means. And what this means specifically for our discussion today and for the revenue cycle of the future is that we need to be able to process clinical data. We need to become more patient-centric. We need to be agents of change through automation and digital in order to react and be able to meet this future of health that is coming. And most importantly, the revenue cycle has to be the one that takes this clinical data, is able to change that into charges or measures of well-being, depending on the reimbursement model of the future, and be able to do this in completely different and new ways than we are currently used to. So this is a very busy slide, but there's a lot of good information on this slide. And as I alluded to a little earlier, these are some of the assumptions that we had to make internally as we came up with our future of health point of view. The first thing I want to put out there is we believe that the future of health is going to result in an empowered consumer. And the consumer will become the epicenter of the future of health ecosystem. And for that to happen, a couple of things. The first is data sharing. We know about PHI concerns, but we also know about PHI privacy and security concerns, but we also know consumers are more and more interested in learning about their health through online means. Think back over the last 6 months. Anytime you've come down with some symptoms, you're willing to go online and Google it, much to probably the chagrin of your physician. But if we're able to figure out ways to share data without compromising privacy and security, consumers will become more and more apt to share data so that they can get real-time feedback and they can get some of their questions answered. So the first assumption I want to lay out there is we think in order to enable the future of health and the empowered consumer, data sharing is going to become bigger and more important. Next up is the interoperable data. There's a treasure trove of data currently available. And if you believe that first assumption, data sharing, then there needs to be a better way to link and mine this data and provide a real-time holistic view of the consumer. And these healthcare ecosystems of the future that are able to process and provide their stakeholders, whether internal or the consumers, with advanced data analytics, those are the ones that will be successful. Now, if you believe in data sharing and interoperable data and the assumptions I just laid out, next up is equitable access. So as consumers have better the ability to share data, as there is better access to interoperable data and pricing transparency, patients will have more and more access to tools to achieve wellness and health. And this will then allow them to make better decisions and choices based off of all of the available information they have. Next up is the empowered consumer piece. And this is at the center of what we're talking about. This empowered consumer, based off of these assumptions I've laid out for you already, they're going to demand transparency and convenience and access. And these demands require the market, so that's all of us on this call, to respond with a fundamentally patient-centric approach. Next up is, once you've got the empowered consumer, is behavior change. So you have to, this is a leap of faith a little bit, but that now that the consumer has all this information and has all this access, is along with artificial intelligence, with virtual reality, remote care, sensors that are tailored to consumer interests, that consumers will take it upon themselves to be proactive and take control of their health and well-being. And then finally, all of these things lead to this pillar on the right, the scientific breakthrough. And so we've seen some extraordinary breakthroughs through stem cells, nanobots, biome sensors, and others. But what we have to believe is these will continue to occur at an exponential pace in order for this future of health vision to come to fruition. And through all of this, what will happen is consumers will receive convenience and competency, and they'll have the data in their hands, and they will be allowed to vote with their feet and their wallets in terms of where and how they receive their healthcare in the future. And so I'll leave you here with a couple of examples. So if you think about it, if you've had to go to the doctor's office recently and say you had to get x-rays or an MRI, in many cases, the doctor's office won't email or provide you that information. And so if you want to go to a specialist of your choice, or you want to work with somebody out of network, it can be very difficult sometimes. And we think the future, the empowered consumer of the future, will find other ways to have their healthcare needs met if our industry is not able to evolve. And then another example I want to give you is, this is, again, something I think most folks can relate to, is the price of college is extremely expensive. Higher education, it's exploding, and four-year colleges can easily run to be $250,000. And that doesn't show signs of slowing down. But one great example, and I'm not sure if folks have read, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago, is Purdue University. They know that the market can't sustain this type of cost overrun. And so they've gone out and they've worked very hard over the last couple of years to make sure that their tuition prices stay static. And so they've realized that what the market can demand versus what the consumers want. And they've gone out and proactively gone and found new ways to disrupt their overall operating and cost model to carve out a niche for themselves in the future. And so those are the two examples I want to leave you with as we think about the empowered consumer and what we need to think about introspectively within healthcare. So the next slide, and internally we always laugh a little bit about this slide because it is a very consultant-y slide, but I think it drives home a couple of very key points. So we're introducing this concept of archetypes because as we think about this in the future, sectors as we think of them today won't exist in the future of health. A great example is it could be the growth of retail health. 20 years ago, we wouldn't have really thought of going to our local pharmacy to get access to healthcare, but that's changed now. And so as we think about these sectors, which 20 years ago we would have thought as completely disparate, retail versus a provider, that's changed already. And so what we've decided is it's not necessarily what sector you're in, but which archetypes you want to focus on. So as I alluded to a couple slides ago, it's thinking about that strategic vision and figuring out where you want to make investments. And so you need to consider how the investments you're making today will play out in the future market with future technology, two big unknowns. But here are the 10 archetypes that we think will win in this world of 2040. And organizations which play across multiple archetypes and differentiate themselves will be able to create a unique business model. As revenue cycles based on your own healthcare system, which in some cases you don't necessarily have control over, and your individual experiences, and what I mean by that is thinking about the size and scale of your health system, thinking about the settings of care that your health system currently focuses on and is considering focusing on in the future, thinking about the current state of maturity of not only your healthcare system, but also your revenue cycle. You can start to think about within these archetypes and the sub-archetypes, where do you think you would invest? So data and platforms, that's the ability to access data and current state platforms and resources. So there's a big IS component there and analytics. But there is an opportunity for the revenue cycle of the future to aggregate, mine, and provide actionable data, not just to the revenue cycle, but to other functions within the healthcare system, operational metrics, clinical and financial metrics. The next archetype is well-being and care delivery. And it's thinking about the current settings of care that are in your healthcare ecosystem, thinking about where your healthcare ecosystem wants to go. So retail, home, post-acute, SNF, all of those settings. And thinking about, okay, now that we have all these different settings of care, and if as the reimbursement model continues to shift, how is my revenue cycle positioned to be able to take on these new settings of care? And if you think back over the last 10 years, being able to come up with a single bill around physician and acute care and the challenges you face there, now you're thinking about retail, home, personal. So if somebody's wearing a wearable device, how are you going to take all of that information and be able to use that and convert that into a metric of well-being? Next up is care enablement. This isn't necessarily focused on revenue cycle. This is more around the future of health, but we wanted to introduce this concept as well. And it's thinking about where does your healthcare system currently, your enterprise, where do they want to focus? So are you a healthcare ecosystem that has a provider-based health plan? Do you have a GPO? How do you focus on rules and regulations? And thinking about how are you able to respond to all of these challenges? So with that, next up is one of our polling questions. So out of the 2040 future of health cost driver, what is the hardest to believe in 2020? Do we have a, there we go. So it looks like the fully inflexible, interoperable institutional data and the behavioral changes driven by interconnected digital tools. Those are the two of the hardest to believe. And that does make sense to some extent. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Curtis, and he's going to talk a little bit more around this, the concept of a digitally powered revenue cycle and how the revenue cycle of the future fits into the future of health and these concepts that we just introduced.
Thanks, Rupesh. So the reason we start with the cerebral future of health concepts is because as the future of health shifts, so will the niche that the revenue cycle plays in. So I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so just setting up a way for you to think through the direction that your revenue cycle will go in this environment. So the revenue cycle is equally as sensitive to all the factors that Rupesh mentioned that we just heard about. So things like interoperable data and consumer data sharing, that will really unlock the ability for your organization to empower themselves through analytics. And there's a big role for the revenue cycle to play there. Also empowered consumers and equitable access. Let me ask kind of the first of many hypotheticals here. If consumers demand or regulations require consumer ownership of their health and financial history, how does that change how you organize your revenue cycle? And underneath all of this is the ever-present financial pressures. So as health management continues its change from large sick care payments driving how the system realizes value, your organization is going to have to shift and going to have to adapt both how it captures its revenue as well as the cost base that it uses to capture that revenue. So our view is that on the way to 2040 and up through 2040, the revenue cycle is going to fulfill three key roles. That of an insights hub, which is leveraging a growing amount of big data to feed insights back to the health system. Becoming a patient-centric platform. You think of this when many interactions, especially the frustrating ones, really tie back to how the revenue cycle plays between the patient and the provider. That relationship's changing, as Rupesh mentioned, and revenue cycle is going to have to continue to adapt to accommodate that. And finally, automation agent. This gets into the revenue and cost pressures that I mentioned, but really what we would challenge the revenue cycle and you leaders in it to do is look outside of your industry to the transaction processing functions in other industries and strive to think through how can you reduce the manual effort that's necessary that's currently inflating your cost to collect to somewhere in the 3 to 5% range compared to the 1% that we see in other industries. So as Rupesh got into, one of the unique twists about the revenue cycle and how it plays in the future of the revenue cycle is that at a macro level, often the revenue cycle is a taker of its role and not necessarily a maker of its role within the broader health system. So that means that the organization's strategy can dictate the chips that you leaders have to play with as you set up your revenue cycle of the future. But I do want to acknowledge that there's flexibility in how much you embrace this philosophy, how much you embrace change, and your performance kind of within that framework that your organization will set up. So as we talk through this slide, I really want to consider your individual organization, where it's going to choose to play within that future of health framework we just went through, because that's going to help you target where you should invest within your revenue cycle. And hopefully this framework can be helpful in helping you communicate the importance of that investment. So the three roles remain the same, but I guess the broader point about where your organizations will be playing is that different systems represented on this call, they may have various dials of how much they play into the patient-centric platform or the insights hub. So I want to go kind of one by one here, talk a little bit more about the requirements and the benefits of you transitioning your revenue cycle to fill these roles in the future. So each of the kind of filled in boxes here under business archetypes, these each represent the archetype that Rupesh was speaking about within the future of healthcare. So your organization can choose to fill these or not, and that can kind of change how much your revenue cycle is empowered. So let me give an example. The Insights Hub here, your ability to derive insights for your organization on the backs of your data, it really depends on your organization's broader data strategy. One spectrum that we see around the technology stack is, what is your organization's EMR strategy? Do you end up on one spectrum, or you're working on one spectrum with kind of an end-to-end single EMR like an Epic, or does your organization instead select kind of best of breed components and connect them together to form the technology base for your revenue cycle operations? And how does that affect the data that you're able to capture and analyze? And another one is the Science and Insights engine. And really what that means, it's kind of a fancy term for what capabilities for advanced data analysis do you have and are you building? So for instance, do you have the ability to query your data to guide your workforce? If any of you out there are VPs of patient financial services and you wanted to kind of check in on if payers haven't responded to a claim that you sent out, let me pull every claim where a payer hasn't responded beyond their contract defined terms. Is that something that you could turn around and hand off to your workforce to look into within a day? Are you able to provide executives the insights they need to make tough decisions? Have you considered how you can utilize analytics, predictive analytics, and machine learning to improve your operational outcomes in an efficient manner? If you answered yes to all of those, you're staring down there at the outcomes of relatively optimized net revenue and good preparedness for moving to value-based models. If you're starting to recognize some gaps for your current state revenue cycle, those are some of the considerations that should be in play as you look towards that Insights Hub role. The patient-centric platform, to go into that one, it's all about how do we digitize and improve patient interactions. So as Rupesh mentioned, think through the care role that your system plays. Is it a community health system, academic medical center, physicians network, some mix of those, or any of the other kind of models of care? And based on that role, what are the patient-facing services that you as revenue cycle leaders control, and what challenges exist today? We see and we help leading organizations digitize more and more of these patient interactions and have seen tremendous value from both a patient experience standpoint as well as the cost base. And finally, automation agent. This one is starting to become very familiar to most folks in the marketplace. Many organizations have tested out automation. You may be in the process of scaling up your automation. You may have bots posting transactions, logging onto payer websites to status claims as we speak, but technology is expanding this even further. So computer vision can now read paper EOBs, post them automatically, and advanced telephony software can eliminate hold times, navigate phone trees, leave voicemails, and a host of other solutions that remove that manual work from your users. Okay, so with all that being said, let us step a little bit past the academic and talk through some examples of techniques that compose each role. On the left side here, I really want to focus in and not get distracted by cool things like integrated wearables, because while it may not be sexy to talk about, the foundations of the digitally powered revenue cycle, that's what allows you to do all of these techniques right and to scale. So to give one example of the importance of these foundations, Deloitte has experience automating similarly painful functions across many clients, but not every company is built equally. So I'll give you two clients that I've worked directly with automating the same thing. They were both hoping to automate an annoying bill edit that was low value add, very simple. We were going to take the document control number and put it on a corrected claim so that the payer had reference to the original claim. Like I said, definitely not sexy, but very important and very low value add from the users. So one client that didn't really have that integrated technology in place, they had ePremise across their enterprise, but each facility was a different instance. And that DCN number that we needed to go get was stored in databases across 30 different host system instances. So the complexity to develop, maintain, deliver that automation, it's extremely high in that case. Just to give you an estimate, maybe 18 to 24 weeks for the development team to build, develop, test, and deploy. Client number two, they're granted a bit smaller, a bit simpler, but they had integrated technology. They connected SSI to pretty optimized series of storing instances. So we were able to build that same automation in 4 weeks. So we definitely don't ignore the foundations as you consider how you can deliver some of these techniques on the middle of the slides. One example that I want to go into here, because we don't have time to dive into all of them, is around digital patient engagement. So one thing that we helped a client with was around their patient-centric platform. So we helped a national health system roll out a patient self-service platform. So this included kiosks at their major arrival points, tablets for when you had complex registration tasks, so you could kind of move away from the kiosk, go sit and fill out the tablet, and even a mobile platform that enabled contactless pre-registration and patient payments. So 2 big highlights of delivering that and value that the client saw. Number one is that we actually never talked about the initiative in terms of cost savings because that was not the primary KPI. Really, the client was focused on net promoter score, which may be a relatively new concept in healthcare. It goes back into kind of retail settings. But what it is a score for how satisfied your customers are with your product. You take the percentage of your customers that would recommend a product, and you subtract the percentage of customers that would definitely not recommend the product. So health systems, for instance, are on a 15 out of 100 on average, meaning that, say, 50% of your patients would recommend your services, 35% would not recommend your services. That's your 15. To put that in perspective, kind of across industries, Starbucks, for instance, is a 77. Tesla is the highest that I could find. They are a 96, and Netflix is a 68. Which Netflix is interesting because it's lower, of course, but if you look at them compared to their competitors, Hulu, Peacock, CBS All Access, they far outpace their competitors, and their success in the marketplace has shown. The other interesting thing about this digital patient self-service platform was the extensibility of it. So as we rolled out the mobile pre-registration function, and we found that with the platform in place, the use cases we could add to that were kind of endless. So for instance, in simple cases, we were able to digitize much of the client's financial counseling screening survey. So that allowed patients to kind of initially screen themselves as they were moving through this self-service process. And the ones that did not qualify for financial aid, they would screen out. The ones that did, they would screen further in to talk to a financial counselor, really lifting a kind of heavy burden on the financial counselor and on the client. Okay, so we'll get into some more detail on a few of these through some case studies further down in the presentation, but want to pause here for another poll question, learn a little bit more about your organizations and where they lie in these roles. So I think maybe the poll was set up a little bit difficult. So when we get into Q&A, I do want to hear a little bit about, for our folks reporting that patient-centric platform being a little bit more mature there. But appreciate it. With that, let me hand off to Mike to talk us through a little bit more about the future of the revenue cycle.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Curtis. So I think just to continue to make this real for folks, we wanted to go through almost the day in the life of the typical patient journey that's enabled by a digitally powered revenue cycle. So for the case of today, we want to be able to take a look at one specific patient in particular. So in this case, his name is Joe, and Joe's journey is an interesting one. So he's in his early 40s, and he recently discovered something a little bit unsettling, that he had an irregular mole on his chest. He knows that he's got a family history of melanoma, And after his initial visit to his PCP, he's been requested to go see a specialist. I'll turn my video on here. There we go. Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to track Joe's journey through the pre-care, day of care, and post-care phases and highlight what his interactions with the revenue cycle look like, as well as taking a closer look at how the digitally powered revenue cycle enables Joe's experience. All right. Yeah, so a lot going on Joe's journey here in the pre-care space. But for a bit of context, Joe's initial symptoms were identified using his mobile app. He took a picture that analyzed his mole and suggested that he get it checked out. So before the visit that we're going to be talking about, he sent this image and analysis to his primary care doctor. And through a virtual visit, his PCP agreed that he should probably go see a dermatologist. So now he's in the process of scheduling his visit, which is going to be greatly simplified through the digitally powered revenue cycle. So through an integrated patient portal, he's able to view his medical history, identify the dermatologist that he saw previously, and then find a place on her schedule, proposing a self-scheduled slot that works for him. Now, obviously, in the background, there's a number of things that we have to do before we can confirm Joe to be able to actually attain that place in the schedule. But from Joe's perspective, all he's going to see is prompts that fly through to his application that allow him to update specific demographic information within his application. He's also being asked to upload an image of his insurance card that using OCR technology will be scanned to confirm that his insurance hasn't changed and that he's still eligible. He's also presented with a patient estimate ahead of his visit and with the option, if he chooses, to pursue financial counseling with financial aid. In this case, Joe feels comfortable with the estimate and declines financial aid. So all throughout the pre-care visit, Joe's experience is reasonably touchless, completely seamless, and allow him to engage with the healthcare system with minimal intervention to his daily schedule. But in the background, obviously, there's a host of revenue cycle processes that are relying on a network of API-based automation to port Joe's medical records into the decision-making of stakeholders at play in order to validate eligibility, and also to provide inputs to ML-based algorithms that are going to be used to calculate an accurate patient liability and potential financial options had Joe chosen to pursue them. So let's move on to the day of care. So Joe arrives for his visit, and his patient portal is going to recognize in his mobile device when he actually enters the facility's geofencing. So there he'll be prompted to complete his check-in process. So while he's completed all of his registration steps already, he's once again presented with a liability estimate. And then within the application, he selects his method of payment. In this case, he's going to use his HSA card, and he's pulling it from his HIPAA-enabled digital wallet. He also authorizes a charge to be rendered at the completion of his encounter. So while Joe sits down to have his evaluation with his dermatologist, there's a transcription software in the background that's recording the clinical encounter. So using NLP and other machine learning-based analytics, a medical terminology library is being parsed to identify the most important words that are being transacted during that encounter, and then assigned out to make updates to Joe's chart and also identify the diagnosis and CPT codes associated with his visit. So after Joe leaves, his experience is pretty simple. A few days later, he receives a care summary that contains the result of the biopsy for his mole. Good news, it's negative, as well as a simplified bill. And that's delivered as a notification from and to his mobile application to charge his HSA card. So he takes a look, sees that the variance is less than 5% of the original estimate, and then quickly confirms the charges. So obviously, this is a pretty idyllic patient experience. And on the back end, there's a sequence of automated tasks that need to be managed by the revenue cycle as it transacts with Joe's insurer. So the processing of his claim is handled with a high degree of automation, both identifying and resolving some of the high volume edits typically associated with claims. It's also pinging payer websites to collect updates on the claim status. It's identifying when additional manual intervention is needed because we don't have a response or we have a rejected response from the payer portal. So the receivable process is also fairly automated. Through an ML-based routing process, the next best action to actually pursue collection on Joe's receivable, were it to exist, would route complex activities to specific users, and then identify simple activities that could be performed by RPA solutions. So once the payment is secured and automatically posted, this automated balance transfer process, also performed by an RPA automation, confirms and triggers the simplified patient statement that's sent to Joe at his application, thus completing the cycle. So all in all, the digitally powered revenue cycle has created a better experience for him and has leveraged digital technology effectively to perform more work better with an overall reduced cost footprint. So I think next we just have another poll question following up on the life cycle of care under the digitally powered revenue cycle. And we're just trying to figure out and get a sense of where folks' priorities right now in the industry are. So if you had $1,000 to invest, or in the case of the poll setup, just where would you invest the most across the 3 different experiences that we talked through? All right. Yep. And I think that's definitely a common response we get from clients as well, that it's the pre-care visit himself where a lot of the denials are generated initially, and any amount of optimization to both improve the patient experience and shore up the initial collection of information will be greatly valued. So at this point, we've talked a little bit about the overall view of future of health, how the revenue cycle fits in to that vision, and some of the different areas in which the patient journey will be improved by investing in the digitally powered revenue cycle. So next, we're going to all tag team a discussion about how we go about building our own digitally powered revenue cycles in each of your organizations. So I'm going to hand it over to Rupesh, who's going to take kind of a first pass at some of the thoughts about what you need to consider in defining your business strategy.
Yep, and so going back to what Curtis and myself and Mike talked about, if you think about where, what type of healthcare system you have. So, and we talked about what is the current level of maturity. That's the first question you have to ask yourself across, if you want to be an insights hub, if you want to be a patient-centric platform, or you want to focus on automation, is how do you currently rate your analytics? When it comes to patient-centric, how do you currently rate your maturity in terms of making meaningful digital investments? And then finally, in terms of automation, where does intelligent automation fit in your strategy, in your digital automation roadmap over the next 24 months? How are you leveraging these analytics? Are you able to use these analytics to drive strategic decisions around digital and automation? And then what type of insights are you able to bring to answer the questions that your leadership has to help them empower them and help empower them to make these decisions and these investments? And so what we've thought about here, and I know cost to collect is a metric that a lot of folks calculate differently. But if you look at the fully loaded cost to collect for both in-scope revenue cycle cost centers, as well as cost centers that fall outside of revenue cycle, but they perform revenue cycle functions, we've seen anywhere between 4 to 6% of cost to collect for most large health systems. And so the question here is, where do you make these strategic investments? And what we've seen based off of some of those case studies that Curtis and Mike alluded to earlier, anywhere from a 20 to 30% reduction while also maintaining revenue leakage. So it's not just saying, hey, I'm going to cut costs and not worry about performance. It's thinking about those two in tandem and focusing on value. And then most importantly, how do I do all of this while creating a patient-centric revenue cycle? So with that, Curtis, do you want to walk through the digitally powered revenue cycle?
Yeah, thanks, Rupesh. So I hope the material thus far has kind of already got your brains running about where you may have opportunities in your organization. As you think through some of those questions that Rupesh prompted, I just wanted to introduce a little bit of additional information around how we're thinking through the offerings out in the market to make these real. So we've collected a number of modules to help you think through the answers. And while we've already highlighted things like digital pre-registration and RPA, I just want to give maybe one more vignette around some emerging analytics tools, and that's what we're calling process bionics. So the amount of data is increasing. I think I've probably said that 3 or 4 times, and it's really true everywhere. One type of data exhaust that we're finding more and more valuable for our clients is utilizing activity data to put together the story on events. So if you think of a user touch, maybe they took an AR follow-up action. As you start to string those events together across the revenue cycle, you can put together and analyze complex processes such as the entire end-to-end history of a patient journey or an account. Going even broader, you can compare the various histories of similar accounts or events and really determine what are those important factors that send us around or along kind of one fork in the road and play into a deviation in outcomes. If I look at 10,000 accounts that have the same denial type and the same kind of general patient type, service line, facility, payer, but I see a few of them don't have good outcomes on them. Well, what was the difference in that process that caused that? Is that quality issue being driven by a particular user? Is it being driven by a specific type of payer plan, or maybe even a department that scheduled the appointment and maybe made a mistake in information gathering up in patient access? So by doing that, you can really start to isolate what tweaks could set that account back on the right path and plug that back into your operations. So that's just one more example of an endless list of techniques for you to select. Would enjoy the chance to talk a little bit more about them, but want to hand off to Mike just to provide a quick survey on the delivery of some of these future revenue cycle techniques.
Yep, thanks, Curtis. And just to kind of pick up the ball from where Curtis left it with Process Bionics, another advantage of being able to analyze your data along the lens that Process Bionics allows is it enables you to see where you're spending a lot of your time performing activities, which can be a powerful tool when you're trying to decide what activities would be the most valuable to automate. So I'm going to talk through the delivery approach that you would take if you were trying to identify and bring to life automation to replace some of the textbook and fairly transactional revenue cycle functions. So in this case, let's say that through Process Bionics, we were able to identify that a specific billing edit was performed 100,000 times in a specific year. And so to resolve that edit, a specific modifier needed to be added. That seems like a process that a well-programmed automation could perform. So in actuality, to bring that automation to life, there are a couple of different steps through design, implement, and monitor. So in the design phase, we've really started the first piece by asking the question, we have an idea that this edit would be valuable to automate, but how valuable actually is it? And does this process align with the overall organizational vision and where we're looking to become more efficient? So one of the first questions we would have to ask is, well, who are the decision makers in the process about whether we want to bring automation into this area of the revenue cycle? So once we've identified our cross-functional team, potentially a combination of billing, coding, and upstream follow-up, we also need to decide, do we have the technology we need to be able to deliver on this automation solution? And that may involve the introduction of vendors such as RPA solution vendors like Blue Prism. And do we have the capability to actually build on their technology? So once we've answered those questions, we move on to the implement phase. And we actually go through the process of building, speccing out, testing, and deploying this edit automation. And a couple of the key questions that need to be answered during this phase really pertain not only to the actual building of the automation, but the organization's readiness to adopt the automation. So thinking through the change management side of the equation and how we're actually going to bring an RPA automation alongside with day-to-day users is an important consideration. We also want to figure out what our toll gates are for being able to actually push this into production. So what sort of risk are we willing to tolerate? And what level of success needs to be promised before we feel comfortable going live? And then finally, we've got the monitoring phase. So once the solution's in place, how are we actually tracking to make sure that we're hitting our delivered benefit target? And then how do we learn from each and every deployment that we make to improve our design and implement phases in the future? Then finally, there's the technology side. How are we continuing to leverage the licenses that we needed for this automation and using them for scale deployment? The result should be identifying capabilities where the organization feels comfortable moving ahead and enabling larger and more significant deployments in the future. So I think next, we were going to talk through a few additional case studies, but I know, just to be mindful of time, I think we have about 10 minutes left. So we wanted to take the opportunity to do one final poll question at the end of this, and then just wrap up really quick with a look at the immediate next steps to launch your revenue cycle journey. So I'll turn that back over.
Thanks, Mike. So when we started the discussion, we talked about 2040, and we said, hey, where do you need to make investments? What's your strategic vision? But in terms of what you can do today, there's a couple of different options. And sequentially, what we've thought about is, let's not worry about 20 years out. Let's focus on the next 2 to 5 years. And so the first part of that is, how do you define the future of health business strategy based off of all those concepts we talked about? And there's still some discussion around those. Some of these assumptions I agree with, some don't. But the ones that you agree with, how would that change where your healthcare system is headed next? And once you're able to define that future of health business strategy, then you can start to think and say, hey, what level of maturity do I currently have in my revenue cycle? What are the gaps that I need to focus on? If the future of health as it relates to my enterprise means that we are going to look at different settings of care, and that's where we're going to grow, how does that change the way revenue cycle does business? That's one example. As you start to think about those two things, then the next logical step is, where are the gaps within my revenue cycle? So we started to talk about it. Analytics is the backbone. But once we've got those analytics and we're using that to assess our gaps, where can we use automation to lower costs? Where can we use digital to become better in terms of patient-centric offerings? Where can we, sometimes it could also be, where do we go back to strengthening our internal processes? But it's using analytics to assess the gap and then starting to think through at a point solution level, what are all of the different options I have? And then finally taking all of those point solutions and coming up with a analytics, digital, strategic roadmap for the next 2+ years, and coming up with that plan and working with the other stakeholders in the enterprise to get the buy-in, the stakeholder buy-in, to allow you to build that revenue cycle of the future.
All right, and I think with that, we wanted to put a wrap on some of the session and just hear any of the questions that the audience has come up with so far.
Well, so Mike, I see that Michael Smith put a question in the chat. It's kind of a 3-parter, and I'm definitely going to cherry pick. Mike, would love to hear a little bit more about what you mean there by number 1. But something that I'm really interested in is number 3 there, the connectivity between the institution and the insurance company to get paid timely and appropriately. So if you think about the revenue cycle's goals as they were 5 years ago, we would talk about low cost adjudication or fast adjudication, or maybe we'd go so far as to say real-time adjudication is the future. But really, if you think all the way out on the frontier, the future is zero adjudication, or you don't even have to prepare an 837 and send it out and wait for the 835 to come back. So one technique that we see contributing to that zero adjudication is the smart contract functionality of blockchain. And yes, that's absolutely out on the frontier. Let's get automation scaled and right before blockchain. But if you really want to think in a visionary manner, having that decentralized ledger between providers and payers that take that paper contract that providers sign with payers and really translate it into a kind of machine adjudicatable set of components so that the provider can link straight into the blockchain, get that smart contract agreed upon and get paid in that instantaneous, no adjudication manner. So I think that's a really good point that you raised around something that's not quite there yet, but we're excited to see the future of.
And Curtis, just to add to that, so I smiled when you said blockchain because I feel like that's something that's still it's like the 2040 concept. It's still out there. But what I would like to add to Michael's question is there's some great digital solutions out there that, based off of how you've aggregated your data and your analytics, that can go out and create some of those payer portals or feeds, if you will, and help with that adjudication process. So it all comes down to how you're able to present that to your leadership, and that's something you should add to your roadmap as you think about it. And there a couple that come to mind are UDA and Notable, and they're doing some really exciting things there as well. So while you're waiting for blockchain, there are still some opportunities. And then and Mike and Curtis, how many times have we gone to a health system that has a provider-based health plan, and you look at their data and it turns out that one of their biggest sources of denials proportionately is coming from their own health plan. So there is an opportunity to break down those silos currently without alienating other payers, and to start that process of information sharing across the two. But that is a great question, Michael.
Thanks.
I see one more question in the Q&A from Jess or Jesse. Are there polls or surveys on how much people are really using the digital tools today? I know there are changes in generational use of digital products, but wonder what the trends are for the past 5 to 10 years. Rupesh, Mike, interested in your perspective there. I don't know other than to say that I'd be willing to bet that it is growing. And I have an interesting anecdote from the kind of rollout of that large national providers kind of patient self-service platform, in that when they were measuring Net Promoter Score and adoption, they were actually seeing higher satisfaction from older patients, to your point around generational use. And it's kind of funny because what it turned out is that healthcare technology is still healthcare technology. It's not quite as seamless as the leading edge apps that may be on an iPad. It was a little clumsy, and your kind of younger 25-year-olds were so used to interacting with Snapchat, Instagram, those apps that are extremely smooth, that they were dissatisfied that the healthcare technology wasn't quite there on the kiosk at the registration desk. But I know that the older generation actually really responded very positively to it.
Yep, and I think what I'd add, Curtis, is I'm not sure exactly what the poll said before, but I think the era we're living through right now is going to be very telling for the population's willingness to engage with digital tools. I mean, thinking about the proportion of care right now that's shifted to a telehealth or virtual environment, in a lot of cases, patients are faced with that being kind of the primary and easiest option for how to engage with the pre-registration process. So I think a stat that I'm looking forward to seeing is, when we translate to a more normalized health landscape, how do those trends continue to carry over for clients who have existing digital technology?
And this is a great question, and I'd have to check with our customers and markets practice. I know we've got some surveys on this. I don't have it readily available, but what I've seen in the past, the way we've thought about this is, if folks, and generationally across the different age spectrum, are okay ordering out using an app, if they're more comfortable with their iPhone in general or their smartphone, then they start to demand that from all aspects of their lives. And so as the user penetration gets better in other industries across all generations, this will become something that people demand out of healthcare. But that is a great question.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Rupesh, Michael, Curtis. It's been a long time in the running. We're really glad we could have you on for this Region 11 event hosted by Washington, Alaska, HFMA. I'd like to thank the Region 11 leadership as well as the association leadership in providing some much needed guidance program-wise at the start of this troubling chapter year. These type of events were a great idea in order to kind of pool our resources and our expertise. And again, thank you, Deloitte, for your contributions. As the Washington, Alaska Programs VP, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'm going to run through our specific state sponsors for you real quick. I'd urge you to head to our page, Washington, WAAKHFMA.org, to check out these sponsors if you're on the provider level, to see about doing business with them, and also to check out the Washington, Alaska HFMA company page. And so before I let y'all go, I'd like to just honor our platinum sponsors, Evergreen Financial Services, Healthcare Resource Group, gold sponsors, Haas Group and Key Bank, silver sponsors, Clark Newber, Dingus Zeracor Associates, Merchants Credit, Pacific Medicaid Services, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Russell Investments, Whitfley, and Extend Healthcare. And our bronze sponsors, Access One, Audit and Adjustment, CBS Collections, Cloud Med, Firm, First Choice Health, Guidehouse, Healthcare IP, KPMG, Resource Corporation of America, Triage, and the Capital Group of Washington. Again, thank you, Rupesh, Michael, Curtis, and I'll hand that off to Ramona for any final remarks. And thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Be sure to sign up for our next webinar for Region 11, December 15th. Other than that, you guys have a wonderful week. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.